Thank you so much for joining us this evening. If you're in the East Coast or earlier, if you're in another time zone, thank you for joining us for the April session of the Eagle Family Webinar Series. My name is Samantha Caruth. I am in the New Student and Family Programs team, and I'm excited to help you learn more about living off campus at American University. I know that our audience this evening is filled with family members of first-year students, sophomores, juniors, seniors, and there's so much to learn. We're glad you're here. I'm going to kick off to my amazing colleagues who are joining us from Housing and Residence Life, Kaylee McDonald, who's Associate Director for Housing Assignments and Communication, and Dr. Justin Bernstein, who's Deputy Dean of Students from the Office of Dean of Students. And I'm going to pass off to Kaylee first to give you some great tips, tools, and tidbits to learn. And if you have questions along the way, please feel free to drop them into the Q&A into the chat. And they'll probably be answered along the way by our presenters. So with that, thank you so much. I'll kick it off to you, Kaylee.
Awesome. Are you advancing the slides? Because
Yes.
Okay, great. We're not seeing it on the Zoom screen.
There we go. There we go.
Awesome. Thank you, Samantha, for that. So like she said, I am from the Housing and Residence Life office, but today I'll be talking about our off-campus housing, some tips and resources while you're looking for your off-campus housing, and just some resources that we provide in our office. So just some quick facts about off-campus housing at American University, if you want to click kind of next here. So American University is located in Ward 3. So that is located near Tenleytown, Friendship Heights, Spring Valley, and Cathedral Heights neighborhoods. So that's considered a very safe part of DC. So we're in that kind of northwest quadrant of DC if you're unfamiliar with the area. And just to highlight where most of our students are living off campus, if they're living off campus, they're particularly living in the Tenley or Cathedral Heights areas, with some students living in Glover Park or Georgetown, and then also some students in the Van Ness and Cleveland Park area as well. Most of the students are living off campus with others. So 71% of students, when we polled them last year, said that they were living with other people. And about half of those students said that they were only living with one other person. So, you know, a lot of people are having a roommate in these times. And then 80% of students that lived off campus live in an apartment or an apartment complex. And then obviously 20%, you know, living in a house. And then just to give you some perspective of rates of what that would look like. So most of our students who are living with others, their monthly rent costs would come out to about $1,300, and students living alone, just around $1,900. That would put your average monthly rent for all of those students just around $1,482. I will say you can find cheaper options from both of these groups, or you can find more expensive options. It really depends on what you are looking for, which we can kind of get into in this next slide. So the factors that you want to consider when you were thinking about living off campus, the first big one is location or proximity. When we did survey students this past year, a lot of students said that proximity or location in relation to AU was the most important factor when deciding where to live. So thinking about, is it walkable to AU, or is there easy access to some sort of transportation, knowing that, you know, the AU shuttle goes to and from Tenleytown and to and from Spring Valley quite frequently, but then we also have access to NV Metro buses or kind of the Metro Rail itself, and students that are enrolled full-time have access to that U Pass that will give them that transportation for free throughout the semester. So kind of thinking, what are those transportation pieces look like? Also thinking about, does the location have easy access to other things that are important in your life? So any off-campus jobs, internships, you know, if you babysit down the street, can you get there easily from where you want to kind of have that apartment? And then also thinking about, lastly, proximity to grocery stores, restaurant, banks, or other necessities. So if you're someone that knows that you like to pop over and make a lot of stuff at home, can you get to the grocery store easy? And then what would that commute look like? Bringing all your groceries back? Do you actually get on the bus or the metro, or can you just walk? The next factor is, most common, we're thinking of cost. So thinking about what your monthly budget is. And in addition to just your apartment or your house rent, think also about the food costs, the transportation costs, if there is, parking that you need to pay for if you have a car, if that is included within your rent or if that's an additional fee. So thinking about what that monthly budget is when you're going to look for an apartment. And then also thinking about, are you okay sharing a room or sharing an apartment, which would then reduce your costs. If you really will value having your own space, then you know kind of what your monthly budget would factor in there. However, if you say, I'll have 2 or 3 roommates, great, then you can kind of play a little bit more with your monthly budget because you can kind of split those, utility costs and things like that amongst multiple people. Speaking of utilities, looking at if the rent does include any utilities or amenity costs. So, asking up front, hey, this is the base rent. What is it for trash? Am I paying for electric? Is it included in the rent, or is that an additional fee each month that you have to then consider? Thinking about, getting Wi-Fi, things like that, that you'll need to add those additional costs into your monthly budget. And then when you're actually going to apply for a place and secure that lease, thinking about what the security deposit looks like, or if there's an application fee. A lot of times apartments will tell you, there's an application fee and then there's a security deposit. Is that security deposit, do you receive it at the end of your lease, or is that just kind of like a down payment? What does that look like? Sometimes it's first month's rent, sometimes it's a little bit less. So what does that look like for that particular building or that accommodation that you're looking for off campus? And then some other considerations that I like to mention as you're looking off campus is, really think about what you're looking for in an off-campus rental. So, take stock of what you're valuing, about where you currently live. So, does it have on-site laundry? Is it valuable for you to have an updated unit or updated appliances? Do you want a private bedroom or a private bathroom? For example, I really value natural light. So when I was searching for apartments, I tried to look for places that I could feel like I wasn't, tucked away in the corner. I really valued having those windows and access to natural light. So that was one of my kind of non-negotiables when I was going and doing virtual tours and going in person. What would that look like for me? And then the other thing that I would also, take into consideration is, what are you looking for in a potential roommate? So if you're a current student, you might have a lot of people that you can choose from to live off campus with. Some of them may be your best friends, some of them may be friends of friends. But you need to think about what you're kind of looking for in that potential roommate. Are you looking for an absolute best friend? You can do everything together, or are you just looking for someone to really, mesh well with and have similar living styles? So someone that, maybe has similar class schedule or a similar routine as you, when you go to bed, when you like to study, things like that, that you can kind of easily cohabitate in a space together. And then the last consideration I like to always highlight is, what does the lease look like? So really reading the lease, sometimes it can be long, but reading the lease and, seeing if it's a 12-month lease, is it month to month? Is it a sublet, or do you have the ability to sublet if you need to go abroad or anything like that? Thinking of those things over before you sign and asking those questions to make sure that you understand what you're kind of, putting yourself into that contract and what that looks like. All right, and so now that we've kind of talked through some things that you should be looking for, we'll talk through some resources that we have available to you. So the biggest resource that we have available in Housing and Residence Life is the access to this off-campus listing site. So it is in partnership with apartments.com. However, it's available to only AU students, and properties that list on this site know that they're listing specifically for the AU community. So all of the landlords and apartments do provide proof of a basic business license, which in DC is required to have a rental property. Even just for a room to rent out, they need to have proof of a basic business license with the district. And then Maryland, Virginia, any properties that are in there, we do also require them to have that basic business license, just as a kind of precaution, so we know that they are, allowed to rent this property. On the website, you can search for sublets and active listings by price, location, or other criteria. And they've actually just added a really fantastic feature that you can actually look at any property and see the walkable distance or transportation distance from key points on campus. So if you know that you'll be visiting the Spring Valley building very frequently, you can actually see the distance that to get there from that, whatever the rental unit is. And then the other great thing that you can also search for is roommates. So if you are interested in searching for a roommate and trying to find a potential match with others that are in the AU community, you can kind of put yourself up on kind of like an eHarmony like style site, kind of add a little photo, a little bio, what you're looking for, and you can search for other students that are in the community that are looking for roommates. Some other resources I always like to highlight, that aren't affiliated with AU, but are very, very great resources. Apartments.com obviously is a great resource. I also like to just look at Google Maps. If you or your student know, the area that you generally want to live in, the kind of general vicinity to campus, you can just start there and then just search for apartment buildings, within a 5, 10, or 15-minute walk to campus, and kind of start there to see the neighborhood, see what it looks like, and see what the options are. And then you can go directly to those property websites. And then Facebook groups are still very much alive and well in DC, and especially in the rental business. A lot of people will post on different DC sublet groups and things like that for, rooms or entire apartments that they're looking to sublet, or even property owners and landlords will also post on there to look for potential tenants. So those are definitely great to kind of, peruse to see where people are living, or to kind of see what's available very quickly, because sometimes, depending on when you're looking, it can get snapped up very quickly. And then just some general tips and for, renting in DC. Typically recommend starting to look for an apartment 90 days prior to your move-in date. So if you're looking, or your student is looking to move in early August, that would put you about around early May to start really looking at what you want to, where you want to live, signing that lease and things like that. 90 days out is when most people will be giving their notices to their apartments if what they're going to return or re-sign their lease. So that will give you a good idea of what will be available. Students should absolutely familiarize themselves with the DC Tenants Right and the Office of the Tenant Advocate. This is a fantastic resource that can help students through any issues if they do live off campus and need assistance, working with their landlord. I like to kind of say, as my phrase, DC is great for tenants if you know your rights. So knowing kind of what you're responsible for, what your landlord is responsible for, and then using those resources if anything does, look not correct while you're living there. A great thing for students that are currently abroad, or students that maybe will be going home for the summer, a lot of apartment buildings will have on-demand virtual tours available on their websites, or they will have virtual walkthroughs with you. You just need to ask. A lot of times I will see people, doing the little iPad around the space. Obviously, it's not the same thing as going into a space and touching the cabinets and things like that, but it's great if you're not local to DC, or if you leave for an extended period of time, like going abroad, for students to be able to still have that opportunity to see kind of the layout, understand, and be able to ask questions to the leasing agent directly. And then the big thing, which will kind of help segue us into Justin's piece, is once you find a place, be a great neighbor, introduce yourself, and kind of, maintain a positive relationship with your neighbors.
Thank you, Kaylee. That is a perfect segue to my section. Hi, everyone. I am Justin Bernstein, and I am the Deputy Dean of Students here at American University. And next slide, please, Samantha. Part of our office's responsibility is ensuring that all of the students who live off campus, particularly in the areas right around AU, so these are the 20008, 20016, and 20007 zip codes, are completing the off-campus living orientation. So this is an online course through Canvas, which students will use for their academic courses as well. and it takes about 30 to 45 minutes to complete. It's a series of videos and then some questions that just check students' understanding of the information. Some of the topics that are covered are, of course, safety and security, living in the neighborhood, so how to be a good neighbor, tips on maintenance and upkeep. Some things aren't really always common sense. So, for example, in Washington, if there is snow on the ground outside of your property, whose responsibility is it to remove that snow? The person who lives there or the person who is the owner of the property who's renting it to somebody else? So, there's a lot of tips and tricks and nuances that are discussed in that orientation, as well as university resources and local resources, such as the Office of the Tenant Advocate and other DC government offices, as well as students have to review our Good Neighbor policy. Next slide, Samantha. To sum up the Good Neighbor policy, we just expect our students while they're in our neighborhood, and we consider really all of DC to be the neighborhood, but particularly around the campus, to adhere to local policies and regulations such as noise ordinances, trash pickup, and being attentive to their property. Parking, all parking is required to be either on campus or students are required to use public transportation to get to campus. So if you are bringing a car to campus, you can't just park on the street. Of course, if you're renting a property in the area, you can park in front of your home, but you can't, drive to campus and park in front of somebody's house next to campus. We really expect our students to treat our neighbors with respect, because they are a reflection on our school, and we really pride ourselves on having a good relationship with our students. I will say AU students are pretty well behaved off campus. I think I just did a report this week. We had 8 complaints from the neighbors this whole year. So usually they're about noise and parties, and we try to resolve those through educational conversations with students. Of course, if there's repeat offenders or it's something very egregious, we might have to adjudicate things through the student code of conduct, which takes me to the next slide. So in our off-campus orientation, students basically pledge to adhere to our Good Neighbor policy and also acknowledge that even when they're off campus, they're still being held to the student code of conduct. This applies for all students, whether they're living on campus or off campus, whether when they're out in the community, they're still adhering to the student code of conduct. And they just acknowledge that if something does go awry, we are going to manage it through our processes. So the Good Neighbor policy isn't anything super out of the ordinary. Quiet hours being from 10 p.m. to 7 a.m. and at other times as appropriate, using your judgment, and just maintaining your property. So if you have trash, make sure it's in the receptacles, things of that nature. So as long as students read it, it really shouldn't be too much for them to handle. And of course, my office is always here as a resource if things do come up. And I've certainly worked with students to navigate more tenuous relationships that they've had with neighbors, and thought of ways that they can be proactive about, getting a positive relationship with their neighbors. For example, one group that I worked with actually baked cookies and sent them all around the neighborhood with their contact information, letting them know that they're going to be having a birthday party. And so the neighbors were very appreciative of that, and not only the cookies, but also being able to just text the students, if the noise was too loud. So again, our students are pretty well behaved and willing and wanting to be good neighbors, which I really appreciate as somebody who's responsible for also managing our neighbor relationship as well. And with that, I think we will move on to questions.
So there were some questions submitted in advance, and I think that you covered so many of the topics. Let's see, Kelly, can you talk about if a student is going abroad in a fall or spring semester? How does it work in terms of typically leases that we understand they're usually a full year long? How would it work for a student who's going to be off, not living in the apartment or house for part of the year?
Yeah, so we'll typically see students that, will make plans of, my friend's going abroad in the fall, I'm going in the spring, and then we'll just swap out. They kind of make those plans at the signing of the lease to kind of make sure that they have someone to take their spot, and then also to know, or vice versa, have someone to come back to or somewhere to come back to. One of the resources I do want to highlight from our off-campus site that we do have is the ability for students, so not just any community member, but for specifically students to list any sublets. So if your apartment or complex does allow subletting, that's a ability for you, the student to find a subletter through the AU community. It's totally free. So while property managers do pay to be on the site, students can list a sublet for free through the off-campus site. But again, you just want to make sure that you're allowed to sublet from your lease.
So it sounds like often the renters or homeowners who are renting or properties have experience with this. So it's about opening communication about the plan.
Absolutely.
Super. Okay. Let's see. This is a great question. Are there any resources that students lose access to if they're living off campus? Would it be meal plans and TDR, the gym, the health center, etc.?
So no, they don't lose access to anything on campus. It is up to the student if they want to have a meal plan. So that's like when the monthly costs come into play of, is your student going to be cooking for themselves, or are they going to be on campus most of the time? And does it make sense for them to get a meal plan? So it just depends on, kind of the personal decision. But in terms of the health center, any kind of student activity things, the rec center, the fitness centers, those are all still, available to them as a student. They're able to utilize those facilities as if they were an on-campus student.
Super. That's an important question. They're still full AU students and they still have access to everything, just not the residence hall in the same way. Oh, there was a question for the off-campus housing website. Can you tell us where to find that? Is it on the student portal or is it at a different location?
I can actually drop the link in the chat. So it's through our housing and residence life, just main website. So it's if you search like off-campus housing American University, it's pretty easy to find. But I will just drop that in the chat just for convenience here. And while I have it being posted, I'll just plug at the top of this page is a registration for a virtual off-campus housing fair that we are actually hosting tomorrow from 12 to 2 Eastern. Students can attend, parents, you can also attend, but we have over 18 properties that will be able to answer any questions live in the session. It's kind of like a drop-in thing. So if you want to, find a property that you like, you can chat with the representative from that property and, chat about their leasing options, what kind of apartments or the building is like, and things like that. So we'll have that just at the top of the website that I just dropped in the chat.
Super. Thank you for that reminder, Kaylee. I will also include that in our post-event email with the link to the virtual off-campus fair. So that's both for family members and for students. So get your student to sign up for that between 12 and 2 virtually. Let's see. This question is about rental property. Are there instances where students can secure rental property with a larger number of roommates, 5 or 6? Are there houses with larger numbers?
I can take that one. The short answer is yes. I've worked with students who have had, 5 or 6, sometimes even more roommates, just depending on the size of the property. Um, but I would always advise that you look at the lease and make sure that the number of people that you have living there is allowed in the lease, that is allowed like with the fire code, and that everyone has clear understanding at the outset of who's getting which space and who's sharing space, who's not sharing space, to avoid any conflicts that might arise throughout the year of living together.
And to follow up on that, the balance of roommate, is there a typical application process with a roommate? I know Kaylee had referenced a little bit about how it can work, either find your roommate first or find your apartment first. What are the different ways of going about it?
Yeah, so I would say if you're looking to live with a roommate, you try to go into the lease together because I think it's just generally safer to have both parties on the lease. And typically properties will have a process, it can vary between property to property, but most of the time each student would apply kind of individually and identify, each other as a roommate or that they're applying for the same apartment, but they would kind of go in kind of parallel to each other because they do need to be like, approved separately. But depending on, the specific building, some buildings will let you kind of, be together. It really depends on the specific property. But, historically, when I've done it, I've always, applied separately from my roommate. And then we've kind of been lumped into one singular lease with both of our names on it.
And for either one of you, Kaylee or Justin, any kind of the cookies idea to let the neighbors know you're having a party, that's a really ingenious idea. Are there any other kind of examples of students being really great neighbors that you would want to plant in folks' minds, ways to be stellar neighbors and great neighbors and continue being great students along the way?
Yeah, definitely. Especially students who live right around AU. There's a lot of families that live there. So I've seen students offer babysitting services. I've seen students who are part of Greek life in a house together do like a cleanup around the whole neighborhood, not just their yard when there was a party. I've seen um, people just write letters to their neighbors, introducing themselves with their contact information, a little bit about themselves, a little about like where they come from and like what their neighborhoods at home are like, so that people understand that, even if they're loud, it's not like they're just students who are coming in trying to be rowdy and not respecting that they're that they're in a neighborhood, because many of them are from neighborhoods similar to the ones that they live in around DC. So I've seen all sorts of things. Pulling up trash cans for your neighbors when you go to get your trash can, make sure that your neighbors is put away or bringing it down for them. If you see like their news in around DC, there's still a lot of people who get the newspaper, so making sure to like throw it up onto the porch rather than just leaving it down on the curb. Seeing students do lots of things.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. So I'm wondering if there are any other questions coming in into our Q&A box. Seems that we've covered a lot of great territory already. So with that in mind, I'm going to direct folks to check out, make sure you look at the website that Kaylee's put into the chat for off-campus housing resources. Attend the off-campus virtual fair tomorrow. And of course, our amazing Dean of Students office is available for any questions along the way. And I guess with that, we will close out our session. Thank you everyone for joining us this evening. Thank you so much, Kaylee and Justin, and sending well wishes to everyone for a wonderful rest of evening. Thank you so much. Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.